Okay, last session we discussed about working with two-way binding techniques. Okay, so last session we saw one example of two-way binding. So how two-way binding works in Angular. For that, we have to use ng model which uses both property and attribute binding, property and event binding. So I explained how the data is accessed and used, right? One simple example of two-way binding. So in data binding techniques, we learned about two important, how one-way binding works, another how two-way binding works. Later you will learn about how to deal with forms. There, how to collect the data from form, how to interact with the form. We will discuss some more points about that. Initially, the basic one-way and two-way binding we learned. So in one-way binding, we can use interpolation, and we can use property binding, and we can use attribute binding. These are the three things in that. In two-way binding, we can use ng model. So ng model, it is a member of Angular forms module. It is defined in Angular forms library. So these are the basic things we discussed about data binding. Next, after understanding the data binding, now we need to go into the topic that is we generally call as Angular directives. So what are Angular directives and how to deal with Angular directives? So in Angular, we need to understand about directives in a component actually. Technically, what is a directive and what is the responsibility of directive, right? Let's see. Technically, actually directive is a function. In Angular, directive is internally is a function. Directive is a function that can extend markup, that can return markup, and make markup more interactive. So these are the work, these are the tasks done by this directive actually. Actually, directive makes HTML, directive makes HTML more declarative, and dynamic also, dynamic. That is the important point. Directive makes HTML more declarative and dynamic. Directive is technically a function. Directive can extend markup, it can return markup, and it can make the markup more interactive. The markup more interactive. The markup more interactive. So what is the point here is how actually it works technically, how it is built in the background, how it is actually built. For example, one basic example is already we used ng model. Actually, ng model is also a directive. Technically, ng model is also a directive. It is also a directive. So it also makes HTML more interactive. I will show you one example how actually we can call a directive. Means what's actually the purpose of directive. So Angular comprises of these directives. We have actually inbuilt directives, and we can create our own directives. In early versions of Angular JS actually, we have to deal with a lot of directives. And for every purpose, we have directives. And now in Angular, the number of directives that we use explicitly are reduced because implicitly they handle the functionality. We have to use only few directives explicitly, others are internally handled. For example, technically, a directive is nothing but technically. So directive, the main responsibility of this directive is actually, so we have HTML. That means suppose we are having an input. We are having an input. So type is equal to text. Type is equal to text. Now, this type is HTML attribute. A directive is applied over HTML. For example, we use the directive. Like some ng class. It is a directive. How many directives are there? We will discuss about that. ng class is a directive. This ng class directive so is used over this HTML element and allows to apply some class dynamically. That means already HTML is doing some work. And this directive is extending HTML. And how it is different between class and ng class. Actually, ng class will apply